good morning, friends. I'm so glad you decided to join me to get your day started with a biblical perspective here on A Moment with Hales. We are going to be continuing our practical Bible study series, and if you're listening on Spotify, Podbean, Apple, Amazon, we are on YouTube. If you would like to check out a YouTube video, I have more of my content here as well. So today we're going to be talking about the literary style of biblical narrative. So a narrative is essentially a literary style of storytelling. Now, storytelling is the most engaging literary device or literary genres. Our brains comprehend information really well in the narrative pattern because it's a start to a finish. And even throughout history, a lot of history was passed down through storytelling. It was a big event that people would go to and listen to stories being told, and they would be passed down from generation to generation that way itself. Now, it's a good thing that our brains like narrative because in the Bible, it accounts for 46% of the literary style. So we have a lot of narrative going on, and you can kind of find it all throughout from the law to the New Testament. It's pretty much all throughout scripture. So reading the Bible is interesting because it's obviously one book. So it's all one large book, but it has a ton of different mini books throughout. But then even within the mini books or larger books, there's a bunch of mini stories that are throughout each chapter. And a lot of these stories are in the narrative style. So the overarching, story, if you want to say, of the Bible itself is Yahweh's mission to reconcile humanity's relationship to himself. Okay, so at the beginning, we have where the relationship is broken, and then we have Jesus who comes kind of in the middle where humanity is reconciled because of Jesus, the perfect lamb. So we have that as the overarching story of the Bible, but then within that, we see all these different stories of humanity either rejecting God or coming to God. It's important to note that Yahweh is the main character. It is his story of how he is trying to restore humanity to himself. And it's really important to kind of step back and remember, as we're reading and seeing all these different heroes and reading all these different stories, all these mini stories are building blocks to one large main theme or main story of the Bible. Another note I want to make is when you're reading the Old Testament, I feel like it's tricky because there's no moral commentary. So you don't, when you're reading through some of these stories, you like get the ick factor. You're like, wow, that wasn't a really great decision. Like, I really want there to be some confirmation in there that that was a really bad decision. But the authors really didn't give a lot of commentary on the stories. They just told them, and then you had to wrestle through the story to understand it. But that's what's cool about reading through the Bible is you are left to wrestle with it. It's something that you have to engage with. You have to understand. You have to roll your sleeves up and get into scripture to kind of reconcile or understand some of these stories when you're looking for that confirmation that that was not okay. But I definitely think wrestling through scripture is a really important thing to do as we're learning and studying it, while we're here on this earth. So starting all the way in Genesis, we have a glimpse into the mind of the creator, which is very cool. And we can see the creation account right at the beginning. It just says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So we have the void and the darkness and the emptiness all the way into contrast of the world that we have today, where God created the animals, God created the plant life, God created the sun and the moon and night and day and all these different things. But then the crowning glory at the end of the creation story is God creating man and woman, Adam and Eve. And we do see that God says 7 times throughout the creation story, God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the seas and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. And the story, it could have just ended there with Adam and Eve in the garden and a God-ordained life and order, and it could have just been perfect, and that's it. However, we all know that's not how the story ends. But I do want to make a point here, which maybe this is just going to say a lot more about me, but I'm just going to say. So growing up in Christianity, and I don't know what you guys think, and even reading like some of these Bible story books, Adam and Eve's story always was, to me, the story of disobedience. So it was like, hey, Adam and Eve disobeyed and they were punished, so don't disobey God. That's the takeaway from the story of Adam and Eve. And as a toddler, maybe that is a good takeaway. But looking at the story of Adam and Eve, there was so much more going on than them wanting to just disobey God because they wanted to be rebellious. God had ordained the order in the garden. God had set up the definition of what was good and what was evil, what was good for them, what was not good for them. Adam and Eve partaking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not only them disobeying God, but they rejected God's ordained order. They wanted to define what was good and evil. They wanted the knowledge of what was good and evil. Essentially, they wanted to take on the role of God in their own lives. And I think that's a very interesting perspective that yes, they did disobey. And as a result of the disobedience, death entered life because sin entered life, and the punishment for sin is death. But also on the flip side, it wasn't so much that they just wanted to disobey. They wanted to define what was right and wrong. They wanted to take on God's role in the garden. And how true is that for us today? I think when the rubber hits the road in Christianity, the hardest part is realizing and submitting to the fact that I am not the author of what is right and wrong. I am living under Yahweh's biblical authority, and I have to sit down and understand scripture and wrestle with what is right and what is wrong. And I don't get to set that. I have to submit to Yahweh, and I have to allow him to define what is good and what is not in my life. And that can be a lifelong challenge. And I will say too, just a personal note here, kind of gaining new perspective on the Adam and Eve story, on how ultimately it was disobedience, but it was really wanting to be our own gods in our own lives instead of submitting to what God is allowing to happen. And I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of, I don't know, suffering sounds like a really extreme word. So I don't want to say suffering, but kind of in the context of disappointment or discontentment, or being in a season that is not the season you would find yourself in. And I will say specifically for me in regards to infertility, you know, when it comes to that type of issue, it's extremely personal, and I'm not trying to offend anyone here if you're going through that journey, because I empathize with you. But in that regard, my husband and I really had to have a lot of conversations and come to the conclusion, our own conclusions, of what is a biblical approach to infertility, and how much faith do I have that if we're not provided a child, that the Lord is still going to provide what is needed in our lives. And I really had to reshape my perspective with all the different options of infertility treatments and different things out there. For us, this is for me, I'm speaking for myself. Everyone has to come to your own conclusion with what you want to do. But we really had to kind of sit down and think about, what does it mean to take the ability to make life into our hands? Like, God provides a child or God doesn't provide a child. And I have to have the same amount of faith either way, that if I don't have a child, or if we don't have a child, that we have to continue to know that God is going to provide what's needed. And it's a really hard thing when you have to sit down and actually think about these biblical principles and apply them in the context of really difficult situations. How am I going to approach a disappointment or suffering or grief or something that didn't go how I thought it was going to, and still allow God to be in his place and the authority? And I have to use biblical principles and submit to the biblical authority in my response to disappointments. And that can be a really hard thing. So anyways, that's a little personal, but I did want to share that because I think it's something that we really do want to wrestle with. And I hope getting practical in this series will bring up things that we can kind of discuss and talk about that are practical when we're reading the Bible and allowing it to transform our lives. But looking at Adam and Eve, it's just such a deeper story. They wanted to take on the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to be their own gods. And this theme is found all throughout the rest of scripture. And that goes on with biblical narrative. So within these stories, we see many themes throughout. And one of the themes are people wanting to take on God's role in their own lives, people wanting to define what was right and what was wrong according to what they wanted, not what Yahweh wanted. So first we have Adam and Eve. It says, when Eve saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. We have Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child and they were like, this isn't going to happen. So they decided what was best for them and they involved Hagar. And then we also have David, who was a man after God's own heart, but he redefines what was good and evil because he wanted to get with Bathsheba. So he decided what was good for him and then went as far as murdering her husband, which is just awful. And then we have the people of Israel, which we could go on and on about, a million stories about them, how they broke the covenant, but also how they were constantly redefining what was good for them. They didn't want to submit to what Yahweh was telling them they needed to do. Like when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and they're sitting there waiting for, 40 days. And Aaron was like, okay, I guess we'll have a golden calf, like whatever, because they wanted to have something to worship like the other nations. They saw that other nations were having human kings and they'd been a theocracy, so they wanted to redefine what was good for them and they wanted a human king. We all saw how that worked out. In these micro stories, we're seeing biblical patterns where people are wanting to redefine what is good and what is evil. Now, when we go to the New Testament, this narrative is still there, but the pattern is actually broken. So it's a really cool theme to see from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And I'm sure you can guess who's the one who breaks the pattern. It's Jesus. So we have in Matthew 4, Jesus is being tested by the devil. It says, again, the devil took him on a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And I will give this to you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So we have that Jesus was tempted to redefine what was good or what was right or what was wrong for him in that moment. And instead of choosing what he wanted and put himself in God's place, he ended up using Yahweh's word against Satan. So the narrative pattern was broken. Unlike all the ones who came before him and inserted themselves into what they wanted to define as right and wrong, Jesus submitted and allowed God to have the rightful place in his life and submitted to his plan. And then we have when Jesus was faced with death, he did not submit to his own desire, but this was his prayer. He said, my Father, if possible, may this cup be taken from me. His desire was, may this please not have to be this way. He continued, he said, but not as I will, but your will. Jesus is there praying in the garden. His desire is for this cup to be taken from him. However, he doesn't choose what he thinks is right for him in that moment. He submits to Yahweh's plan. Again, breaking the narrative pattern that we'd seen all throughout the Old Testament. So my hope in pointing out the narrative literary style or genre that we're seeing through scripture, it gives you a new lens as you're reading through the Bible and gives you another tool that's put in your tool belt that you can pull out as you're reading through to make it a little more interesting as you're reading scripture. I do have some homework because we're going to continue to talk about the narrative style in our next episode as well. So I do want to give you guys a heads up that you can go through and read through some of these passages that we're going to be talking about and maybe be ready to kind of compare or contrast what I find as well. So the assignment's going to be exploring biblical narrative patterns, and you're going to read these following passages and pay close attention to the narrative style and the thematic patterns. As you read these passages, reflect on how the Old Testament stories may be foreshadowing the New Testament story of Jesus and how Jesus might be fulfilling or transforming those patterns that we see. So we're going to read through Genesis 1, 6 through 7, Exodus chapter 14, Joshua chapter 3, 2 Kings chapter 2, and Matthew chapter 3. As you read these stories, this is what I want you to consider. What's happening in each story? What themes do you see emerging? And how are these Old Testament stories setting the stage for what happens in the New Testament passage? And we will go through and break this down in our next episode, but we are going to close with 2 points to reflect on today. What are you allowing in your life to determine what is right and wrong or good and evil? Are there any areas in your life that you are taking on the role of God instead of living in faith that His will be done? So thanks for watching, friends. You are an encouragement to me. I do want to say I did do a video this weekend on Israel, a Coffee and Conspiracy on Israel and TikTok. If you want to go ahead and give that a listen. I hope you get some caffeine this morning and have fabulous days. And I'll be talking to you soon.